And I'm just gonna do, okay, everybody can see? Wonderful. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself while we get started. My name is Erin Becker. I'm a local historian. I graduated from Stony Brook University in 2017 with my BA in History and Anthropology, and I earned my MA in History in 2018. So my graduate research focused on the convergence of women, labor, and the environment through extractive maritime industries like whaling and fishing. So this is a little bit different, but I was drawn into this story through the family history aspect, and I'm always very fascinated by the stories we're told and the stories that we pass down. So that's really what got me interested in this. Through this project, I've really been able to dig into what life was like for women in these Eastern metropolitan cities during the World Wars and in between the World Wars. And I was able to do that by looking through the lens of my great-grandmother. So I've included an outline just so you can see where we're going with this talk. We'll start out by introducing my great-grandmother, Marion Murdoch O'Hara. We'll go into the uses of radium and cover the radium dial painting industry. We will then talk about radium poisoning and industrial disease. We'll talk about the lawsuits and the aftermath of the radium dial painting industry. We'll finish up with a little chat on the legacy of this industry on my own family. So I'd like to set the scene for you. Marion Murdoch O'Hara was born February 27th, 1905. She was born in New York City. She's the daughter of two immigrants, and their names were George P. O'Hara and Marion Dunlop. Growing up in New York City, Marion lived with her parents and two sisters. When she was 17, she married Aidan J. Barrett, and he was a fisherman, or he came from a line of fishermen in Newfoundland. And when they first met, she was a dancer, and he was actually studying to be a priest. So the couple would go on to have 9 children together: Rosemary, Marion, Florence, George, William, John, Patricia, Robert, and Alice. And they lived in Mount Vernon, New York for a time, but by 1925, they had settled in the Bronx. So Marion lived in a changing world. While the atomic age usually refers to the era following the detonation of the first nuclear weapon at the Trinity test in 1945, one could argue Marion came of age during an earlier radioactive craze. So radium had been discovered by Polish chemist Marie Curie in 1898, and it swept through the news and the market like a firestorm. So between 1898 and 1902, Marie Curie and her husband, Pierre, published 32 scientific papers. And one of them announced that when exposed to radium, diseased tumor-forming cells destroyed faster than healthy cells. And here I've included a photo of Marie Curie and another of her and her husband, Pierre. In 1925, the Long Island Traveler reported, "The great wonders of the world are sometimes listed as the telephone, wireless telegraphy, spectrum analysis, the airplane, anesthetics, and antitoxins, and X-rays." So radium was something that was talked about in the news. It was talked about in the media. There were people talking on the street about it. This was a cultural phenomenon that everyone knew about and wanted to use and believed it was very healthy. Radium was a wonder element. It was a miracle cure for those who could afford it. It was used to treat cancer, hay fever, gout, anxiety, and more. Wealthy men and women living along the east coast of the United States sought out radium clinics and spas. They would bathe in radioactive water. They hoped that it would rejuvenate their bodies and stimulate their blood. And scientists knew that radium could deposit in the bones and that it caused changes in the blood, but they viewed this as a really positive change. They thought that it would stimulate the blood and basically keep people very young. So radium was commercial dynamite. It was added to drinks, cosmetics, clothing, accessories, and more. Duramod radioactive toothpaste claimed to make teeth shine brighter. Radiathor, which was a solution of radium salts, was claimed to have curative powers. Revigador pots, and that was a ceramic water crock lined with radioactive material, they were actually used to add radon to water. And one advertisement for Radior Peau de Velour charged, "The big difference, however, lies in what this cream does for your skin and complexion. It not only softens and adds resiliency to skin and facial muscles, it not only imparts a delicate, soft bloom to the surface, but it does what no ordinary cream can do. It energizes, invigorates, rejuvenates, because it contains actual radium. That is the magic behind Radior Beauty Aids." And you can see these are some of the advertisements that people would have been exposed to on a daily basis. They would have seen radium as this wonder drug, and they would have wanted to use it. Radium created products that were both aesthetically pleasing and they were functional. So one contemporary writer argued that one of the big commercial uses for radium in the United States is in the paint. So radium paint shines in the dark. Advertisements popped up in the papers for luminous house numbers and glowing tags to label and differentiate medicines from poisons. An advertisement in the Evening Gazette suggested it is not enough to put poison on one shelf and non-poison on another, for they can get mixed up. And then assurance becomes doubly unsure. The new little tags, illuminated with an undark radium mixture that only and always glows in the dark, is the safest means for pointing out medicinal dangers. Radium could be the magic fix for all problems: domestic housework issues, beauty, and health. Radium paint was used for watches, clocks, ship's compasses, gun sights, aircraft flight instruments, compass dials, and more. Americans wondered at the marvel of radium watch dials. Newspapers ran articles with titles such as "Your Watch a Power Plant," and argued if you own a radium-dialed watch with luminous figures and hands, then you are the possessor of a vast power plant of no mean proportions. There is sufficient radium on your watch dial to haul your train homeward if it could be properly applied. Luminous watch dials had important military applications and also increased in popularity among American civilians at this time. So the Radium Dial Company opened its first dial painting studio in Long Island City in 1917. In the same year, Radium Luminous Materials Corporation opened its doors in Orange, New Jersey. This is a photo of the Orange, New Jersey site. So in New Jersey, U.S. Radium Corporation extracted and purified radium that they had gotten from carnotite ore in Utah and Colorado, and they used this to produce luminous paints. And these paints were then marketed under that brand name Undark. So Marion worked at the U.S. Radium Corporation site in Manhattan, and she may have begun her career like many of the girls pictured here as a dial painter. From 1917 to 1924, approximately 800 girls worked in the New Jersey studio alone. In these dial painting studios, the young women sat in rows, dressed in their ordinary clothes and painting dials at top speed, their hands almost a blur. Each had a flat wooden tray of dials beside her. The paper dials were pre-printed on a black background, leaving the numbers white, ready for printing. At the Orange plant, dial painters mixed their own luminous paint, and this was that same Undark that I spoke about before. And they did this by mixing radium powder, gum arabic, and water. In Newark, Long Island City, Connecticut, and Illinois, these girls were often employed as young as 14 years old. And many of them may have even been much younger because they've found that these girls lied about their age a lot of the time. If their families were in need of money, this was a really good option. And some of these girls came from very poor immigrant families in New York City, New Jersey. So while dial painters were encouraged to work with radium without fear and without protective equipment, the scientists and the owners of the company carefully avoided exposure to the radium. Each dial painter mixed her own paint and used a camel hair brush to apply it to the dials. After a few strokes, the brush would lose shape, so the girls were trained to lip point. And this means that they were told to use their lips to shape the brushes to a point. Lip, dip, paint. Though knowing the dangers of exposure to radium, the radium company assured the dial painters that the radium they were ingesting would not be harmful to their health. Because radium was a wonder drug, the companies told the girls, this would actually benefit them. They could expect their hair to grow longer and shinier, their teeth to be whiter, and their bodies to be overall healthier. And these girls were ingesting minute amounts of radium on a daily basis, every time that they lip dip pointed. So Marion worked in the dial painting business for quite some time. According to her son, she worked primarily as a baker, which means that she baked the dials after they were painted. Her daughter Marion also worked briefly in the Radium studios, but she really hated it. She could not take the smell. It gave her headaches, and she ended up quitting. So dial painting was a really coveted job, and these girls were paid piecework by the number of dials they painted. Kate Moore argues that the dial painters were ranked in the top 5% of female wage earners, and on average they took home $20 a week, though the fastest dial painters could easily earn more, sometimes as much as double, giving the top earners an annual salary of $2,080, and in today's money, that would be about $40,000. For a woman with several young children at home, Marion was likely very grateful for these high wages and relative financial stability. So encouraged by their relative prosperity and the increased demand for dial painters during the war, many of the young women at the factories were able to find dial painting jobs for their sisters, cousins, and friends. At the end of the day, these girls went home from work and they actually glowed in the dark from all of the radium dust that had settled on their hair, their clothing, and their skin. And many of these girls wore it as a sign of pride. I mean, they believed that this work was skilled labor, and it was, and it was viewed as being above working in department stores. So as radium was advertised to have really incredible health benefits, no one took issue with children being exposed to it. At the end of the day, Marion would fill her pockets with the rejects, and those were the dials with mistakes, and with radium buttons. Now, radium buttons, also known as personal radioluminescent devices, glowed light green, and they featured a clip in the back. They were designed for GIs to use at night to identify each other. And according to her son, Robert, the kids had a great deal of fun running around and playing with those. One dial painting company in New Jersey even offloaded industrial waste from radium extraction by selling it to schools for use as playground fill. And he did that. They did that because it looked like seaside sand, and they had to get rid of it. On the left, you could see Marion's young twins, William and Joseph, and on the right, you can see what one of those radium buttons looked like. Radium dial painters were no stranger to fun, and nor was Marion. So these girls were living in New York City in the 20s, and they knew how to have fun after their shift ended at the end of the day. So Barrett family stories paint Marion as this figure who's just larger than life. While the details vary from speaker to speaker, her independence and her fierce spirit is present in every tale. And I mean, the stories vary from Marion was a rockette to Marion liked to go out dancing. She truly seems like she was a force of nature, and I admire her spirit. And socialization and fun were really just a part of the culture of working in these dial painting studios. So the girls befriended their coworkers. They often shared candy that they had kept on their work desks, and they ate lunch together right at their workstations. And they would be laughing and giggling and just really enjoying their work. Especially at the studio in Ottawa in Illinois, the girls sometimes played games with the radium paint. So they would draw mustaches and funny faces on themselves and then run upstairs into the dark room. They would flick the lights off and they would glow in the dark. And they had a fun time doing that. They went out dancing after work, they invested in these fashion pieces, and they enjoyed their prosperity. Dial painting companies also sponsored social events, such as the picnic seen here, to build loyalty and increase employee retention. But summer picnics were really poor protection against radioactive materials, and these women's bodies began to show the effects of industrial disease. The young women began to develop strange sores, pimples, fatigue, stiffness in the body, terrible tooth pain, mouth odor, and facial swellings. Molly McGee, a dial painter in Newark, was the first radium girl to seek out help. And she went to Dr. Neff, a dentist, She was diagnosed with necrosis of the jaw after her jawbone actually broke into pieces during an examination. Dr. Neff declared that Molly McGee was suffering from a condition not unlike phosphorus poisoning. And people suffering from phosphorus poisoning are known to develop phossy jaw. And that includes tooth loss, inflammation of the gums, and a lot of pain. Phossy jaw was an occupational disease which affected people working with white phosphorus without the proper safeguards. It was most commonly seen in workers in the matchstick industry in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So other dial painters soon also began to sicken: Irene Rudolph, Helen Quinlan, Hazel Vincent, Grace Fryer, Catherine Schwab, Quinta McDonald, and more. At this point, dentists across the eastern United States had not actually began to compare notes, but they began to suspect this mysterious illness was some sort of occupational problem. At age 23, Marguerite Carlo, a dial painter in New Jersey, became the first dial painter to bring a lawsuit against the radium industry. When she found a lawyer to take her case, many dial painters began to die very painful deaths, and these women began to suffer from anemia, bone fractures, and necrosis of the jaw. And that's what we see right here on the right. That is known as radium jaw, and that is that bone death that occurs from lip dip painting. While some of the girls died quickly, the disease took years to manifest in others. And when it did, it came in the form of sarcoma. And sarcoma is cancer of the bone and connective tissues. It presents in this way because the body treats radium as calcium and it deposits it in the bones, where radioactivity can degrade the marrow and mutate bone cells. So in putting together this presentation, I made the decision not to include actual photos of the radium dial painters as they suffered from their illnesses and injuries out of respect. These were real young women who suffered terribly, and many of them were truly very young women. If you do choose to seek them out, they are there. You can find them on Google, but just be warned that they're pretty graphic photos. You'll notice a lot of, I think Helen Quinlan is one of the first photos that come up, and she has a massive tumor in her face. So the photos are out there, but they won't be in this presentation. So Genevieve Valentine wrote that the history of business is a history of violence. As early as 1912, the radium industry knew that handling radium could be dangerous. Many of the early scientists who worked with radium had sickened and died. Antoine Becquerel, for example, had carried a small vial of radium in his waistcoat pocket, and he later reported to Marie Curie that his skin had actually become ulcerated in that area. Marie Curie's death to aplastic anemia has also been attributed to her handling of radium. Watch dial companies rejected the claims that their ill workers were suffering from an industrial disease related to their radium exposure. So seeking to protect themselves from legal repercussions and ethical responsibilities, Radium Dial Company and others began testing their employees. They brought in their own doctors, they performed medical testing, and they did not share the results with the girls. In 1925, Martine Lech of Orange, New Jersey was found to have flushed skin and a bilateral enlargement of the thyroid gland. She had worked with U.S. Radium Corporation for only a year and a half. 35-year-old Elizabeth Edwards of Nutley, New Jersey, was found to have enlarged cryptic tonsils and stiffness in her right ankle. Edwards refused to have her teeth examined, but doctors noted that her teeth seemed soft and decayed. Edwards had worked as a painter with U.S. Radium Corporation for a year and a half. For the prior 6 years, she had worked with another radium corporation. So the dial painting companies actually often attributed their worker deaths to syphilis as a way to smear the reputations of these girls and further cast doubt upon the link to industrial disease. In May of 1927, a lawsuit was filed against the U.S. Radium Corporation by a young New Jersey attorney, Raymond Berry. And Berry was working on behalf of Grace Fryer. Along with Fryer, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schwab, and sisters Quinta McDonald and Albina Larice joined her in the case. Each woman asked for $250,000 in compensation. And by this point in time, 4 workers had already died before the trial even began. At the beginning of the trial, Fryer had already lost all of her teeth and could not sit up without a brace. McDonald and Larice were bedridden, and by the second hearing, all of the women were too ill to attend. In November of 1928, the inventor of radium dial paint, Dr. Sabin Von Sochocky, died. He was the 16th known victim of radium poisoning. He had gotten sick by handling radium paint, and he had actually made it a point throughout his career to handle the radium vials with his hands with no protective equipment to show the girls that it was safe. Author Claudia Clark has argued that government indifference to the Radium Girls campaign for the recognition of radium poisoning, their quest for compensation, and their desire for preventative measures for future girls resulted from the influence of business. So women workers and women reformers, in this case, formed a really effective coalition that had to prove the existence of a new industrial disease. Reformers such as Catherine Wiley, the former dial painters, doctors, and lawyers all pushed for the government to really investigate this industry. So in the wake of scientific findings attesting to radium's harm, they clamored for radium poisoning to join the ranks of legally recognized industrial diseases. At this point in time, there were only 5 recognized industrial diseases, and radium poisoning was not one of them. So their biggest challenge lay in proving the link between their illnesses that they were exhibiting and the radium they had been exposed to day after day. They also had to prove that this radium was so dangerous to them even in minute amounts. So the women, their families, and the media banded together in a campaign for justice and to prevent further suffering. And they did this even though they knew many of them would not last or live to see justice or reparations. So the case did draw attention to the need for government supervision and regulation of the use of these radioactive substances. It also drew attention to the need for worker health safeguards. They needed protective materials. And it really familiarized the public with the fact that radium was dangerous. Radioactive materials were dangerous to the general public. It wasn't a wonder drug in the sense that people should be exposed to it day after day, even in minute amounts. On June 4th, 1928, the New Jersey women accepted an out-of-court settlement. Dial painters in other cities, such as the Radium Dial Company in Ottawa, Illinois, would be told by their companies that it was the element mesothorium that was the culprit in New Jersey, and that their paint would be safe because it contained no mesothorium, only radium. And this would later be proven false. In 1935, when 5 of the Ottawa dial painters attempted to sue Radium Dial Company, they were halted by the statute of limitations. They did eventually win damages in 1938, though. And in the Ottawa case, those girls took longer to sicken. The difference between the formulas between the companies actually resulted in more sarcoma and less presenting with the radium jaw. And those girls themselves were radioactive. Their bodies would glow in the dark towards the end. Their sisters who would share their beds because the houses were too small also ended up getting cancer. This was a very harmful industry in not only the girls who worked it, but the people who were around them. And the Radium Girls in New Jersey, their case established the right of individual workers to sue for damages from corporations due to labor abuse. So they were one of the first, and I don't know that we always hear enough about them in the context of New York history, but also labor history. So radium has a half-life of 1,600 years, which means that surfaces coated with radium paint, such as watch faces and hands, remain a health hazard for long after their useful life is over. Radium was used as a luminous paint until the 1960s. At that point, there were other radioactive paints that companies moved towards that were safer, both for workers and for households to be handling. But still, for radium to be used into the 1960s is mind-boggling, to me at least. The U.S. Radium Dial Corporation site in Orange, New Jersey was placed on the Superfund program's National Priorities List in 1983, and it was placed there after it was found to have a hazardous level of radioactivity. According to the EPA, waste from the plant was disposed of on and off the facility property, contaminating the site and nearby properties with radium-226. And when people are directly exposed to radiation, inhale radioactive dust particles, or inadvertently ingest radioactive particles, they may suffer adverse health effects in the form of increased risk of certain types of cancer. In February of 1989, David Pitt reported that the federal government was about to begin the process of removing dangerously radioactive radium from an abandoned medical supply plant in Woodside in Queens. And officials were planning a campaign to reassure neighborhood businesses and residents about the safety of that 4-month operation. The radioactive materials were removed from the Radium Chemical Company, operated by Joseph A. Kelly, and he was the son of the owner of the Radium Dial Company in Ottawa. So they had moved their operations from Illinois back to New York and put it under his son's name. So according to reporters, the Queens site is believed to have the world's largest concentration of radium. That is the equivalent of 4 ounces of radium in 2,000 to 3,000 vials formed into tiny needles at the plant. So I first stumbled upon the story of the Radium Girls reading the blog Read More Science. And Sarah Olson, a science writer and founder of the blog, observed that Radium Girls is a tale of what happens when a corporation silences women and suppresses science. It is caution against heedless belief in a substance we don't quite understand, and an outcry against unjust treatment of innocent workers. So this story, which is virtually untaught in American classrooms and not always talked about in daily life, has a living history. The Center for Human Radiobiology was developed to study the surviving dial painters. Now, not all of these girls died right away. Some of them actually survived into their 80s, but continued to present with significant health issues. Many of them suffered from honeycomb-like bones, where their bones actually became very hollow and very brittle from all of the exposure to radium. So Kate Moore's book and Sarah Olson's book review jogged memories of my own mother speaking on family history. And this launched me on a genealogical investigation. And see, I knew the end of this story, but I didn't know the beginning. Marion's exposure to radium lingered in her body. And Marion, who was my great-grandmother, died in 1976, and she was suffering from Alzheimer's and aluminum deposits on the brain. Was her illness the result of radium exposure or of exposure to another hazardous substance during her time in industry? I will likely never find out definitively. I know that after she worked as a baker, at some point she did work on airplanes. She worked in industry. She was very, very busy woman and very strong. Interestingly, Alzheimer's, aluminum, and industrial disease have recently been linked in the case of a 58-year-old man who was working in England in preparation of insulation materials for nuclear fuel and space industries. Marion's son, Robert, does attribute her decline and eventual death to her time at the U.S. Radium Corporation. Though I've had very little contact with my mother's paternal family, I do remember hearing stories about Marion, her children, and the physical impact dial painting left on our family. Several of Marion's children, including my grandfather, suffered from cardiac illnesses. Many of his siblings passed before their time. Marion's daughters waged battles against cancer and autoimmune disease. Before losing her fight to ovarian cancer, Marion's daughter Alice once attributed the high frequency of cancer among the women in the family to the watch dials the girls had played with as children. And this isn't just a story from my family. I know one of the Ottawa dial painters, Catherine Donahue, her daughter also presented with these very serious cardiac illnesses, industrial illness, legacies of her mother's industrial illness, and she also passed way before her time. So I will forever be grateful to this research project. It opened new doors to family members who I had never met, and it started this shared dialogue about our family's past. So like detectives, we pooled our knowledge about our family members. We combed through ancestry.com, family search, looked through whatever business records we could get into online, Smithsonian collections, whatever was digitized. And her son was able to share some very precious memories and hints with me as we tracked down more information about Marion's life. Her granddaughters were able to shed light on their aunts, their uncles, their parents, their grandmother, and talk about, this is something the family hasn't really spoken about or reckoned with yet, but this is our history. And after all, family history is really the only way I'll ever meet my grandfather, many of his siblings, or my great-grandmother. And though radium dial painting was discontinued in the 1960s, the legacy of this industry is still so very tangible, on the bodies of the women they employed as dial painters, on the families they left behind, and on the environment. It lingers even in the environment. Within the past few years, there's been a lot of new attention to the case of the dial painters, which is fantastic, as this is a history that more people should know about. Kate Moore's book on the right here has been incredibly popular. And if you want to learn more about this topic, it's a fantastic resource. I enjoyed it. Her narrative of this story is so powerful, and her descriptions are captivating, and you really can't put the book down, and I didn't. I think I might have read it straight through. But it really gives you a good picture of what life was like for these girls, and the way that the industry worked against them. There is also a movie. In 2018, a movie came out about the dial painters, and it seems that another one has come out this year. I haven't yet had a chance to watch it though, but I am very curious, and I am looking forward to it. So I'll now open up to any questions you may have for me. So let me know.